Hi, I'm Todd Bolsinger. Greetings to all of you at the conference. I'm so sorry that we are not together. I have been thinking about this for about 2 years. Paul Mundy invited me a long time ago to spend time with you in what would have been Grand Rapids, Michigan. And then I think there was another location, and then now we're back on Zoom online. I certainly hope that my presentations will be able to serve you well in this moment as we think about what it's like to lead into the uncharted territory that we find ourselves in. But I want you to know that even as I did these presentations, my prayers are with you, and I'm hoping that you'll find a sense of hope and a sense of being equipped for the day in front of us. So this first presentation is called Adventure or Die. Enjoy it, even though it has kind of a depressing title, and know that I'm just thrilled to be with you.
In 1987, when I was 23 years old, I was invited by the First Presbyterian Church of Hollywood to become their college minister. I was only a year out of college at the time, and I had spent the previous 5 years working for Youth for Christ, doing youth evangelism and youth outreach to unchurched high school students. When they invited me on their staff, they also invited me to start taking master's classes at Fuller Theological Seminary. Indeed, they said they were willing to pay for my master's degree. Wherever I go around the country or whenever I have a chance to talk to people, I love to tell the story of a church that invested in me when I was a little more than just enthusiasm and arrogance. But their investment in me way back then in 1987 continues to shape the way that I lead and think about the church and serve the church today. When I started in my master's program, all I wanted to do was be able to teach the scriptures well. They had said, you're going to run out of those little youth talks you do by Christmas. Well, I'd run out of them by Thanksgiving. So I was thrilled to have these tools that I could literally put to use every single week. Things I was learning in my evening classes or during the week, I would use on Sunday mornings when I would teach. And it shaped me. I ended up going on to get a PhD at Fuller. And because they had paid for my master's degree, my wife and I could afford to pay for my PhD one class at a time. But because I was working full time in a church, I felt the pressure all the time about getting this thing done. So I took a 4-year master's degree and I crammed it into 9 years. By the time I finished, I was the senior pastor at San Clemente Presbyterian Church. And my doctoral dissertation, which was on communal practices of spiritual formation, became a book, It Takes a Church to Raise a Christian. I have lived my life at the intersection of spiritual formation and leadership challenges. And it started with this deep dive into rethinking spiritual formation in the Reformed tradition in a much more communal direction. Shortly after the book was published, my dissertation was published, it was turned into a book called It Takes a Church to Raise a Christian, How the Community of God Transforms Lives. And I was invited by a group of Methodists in Portland, Maine, to fly across the country and engage them in 3 presentations, one on spiritual formation, one on Christian community, and one on the mission of God in the world. When I finished those 3 presentations, I was invited to spend some time with anybody who wanted to in a question and answer. And about 60 people showed up. Well, my wife's a therapist, and she has taught me that in groups of 60, especially when they're face-to-face groups, all the extroverts shine and all the introverts hide. And everybody likes it that way. But all the questions end up being extrovert questions. So she taught me a technique that I sometimes use where we gathered up all of the questions ahead of time, and then we tried to answer them together based upon what were the questions most people had on their mind. There was one dominant question that almost everybody had in their mind. I'd come to speak about spiritual formation, Christian community, and the mission of God in the world, but what everybody wanted to ask was, how do we keep our churches from dying? One of the reasons why I like to start with this conversation, this illustration, is because it reminds us that in every gathering, while there may be a written agenda, there's usually an unconscious agenda going on underneath. There's an agenda about the things that keep us up at night, make us anxious. It's the questions that we showed up with hoping would get answered that are most troubling to us, or the things that if we had an opportunity to be with colleagues or with resource people, we would want to make sure we asked. I'd come to talk about how the church could grow deeper and more connected These folks were trying to figure out how the church could survive. This was New England in around 2005. After a generation of most of the mainline church had already had steady decline. And now that same decline that is catching on and the rest is happening to the rest of the church was already well accelerated then. They had large cathedrals, some of them going back 200 years, many of which stood mostly empty, burdening the congregations they had. How do we keep our churches from dying? Go with me from Portland, Maine to the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. But as we do, think about this definition of leadership. Leadership is energizing a community of people toward their own transformation in order to accomplish a shared mission in the face of a changing world. What I want to say is that every question that we come with, every conscious or unconscious question that we come with, every question that's going to challenge our leadership is going to require our own transformation. That leadership, genuine leadership in the world, and especially leadership in the church, is a leadership that goes through the path of transformation. That you cannot solve the greatest problems, the one that keep you up in the middle of the night, the ones that are part of that deeper agenda, without your own transformation. So now to Alabama. A friend of mine was near the end of his entire ministry, It had been over 40 years, all in Alabama. We were an interesting contrast. He was near the end of his ministry. I was in the beginning of mine. He had served entirely in Alabama. I had served entirely in California. So when we started sharing stories about our perceptions about the way the church was changing, I was very keen to find out how had this part of the country that seemed in some ways as if it would never change experienced the changes of the last generation. And remember, this is pre-COVID at the time, right? This is 2005. He says to me, one thing I want you to remember is that even in places like Alabama, we've had dramatic changes in our culture. When I started in ministry, we didn't even keep track of things like church membership or church attendance. We had to turn in reports, but we didn't worry about them all that much because everybody knew that everybody who skipped church on Sunday would be asked by his boss, and notice the his boss, on Monday. What he was describing is what we call Christendom, where Christianity is in the center of culture, where Christianity has a home court advantage, where the expectations and assumptions of Christianity are expected and assumed to be in line with the culture. And even the question that he assumed would be asked, where were you and why weren't you in church on Sunday, is the kind of question that today could get a boss fired or a company sued. So we see this radically changing world right before our eyes in every context. In 1963, there was an article in the Los Angeles Times. I know this because I have that article in my office at the school. The paper was saved because it was the front page was an article about the Warren Commission a week following the Kennedy assassination. They gave it to me because it had an article on the then 9,000 member Hollywood Presbyterian Church, which was the biggest Presbyterian church in the country. The Los Angeles Times was featuring Hollywood Presbyterian Church. That church that had 9,000 members then had about 4,000 members when I served there in the 80s, and today is under a few hundred. But the reason that I kept it is because there in the corner of the back page of the front section of the LA Times, the Los Angeles Times would publish a week's worth of daily Bible readings. If you can remember a day when the LA Times or the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or whatever paper that you think of would actually help you with your morning quiet time, then you can remember Christendom. If you travel around the country into many, many small towns around the country, you will find that there was a time in our history where it seemed as if there was one city planner, that in almost every town, there's a town square with a statue of the most famous dead guy, and it's usually a guy. There'd be a library, a courthouse, and the first church, whoever got there first. First Methodist, First Presbyterian, First Lutheran. All the other first churches are all on Second Street. Why? Because everybody assumed that the center of culture would be law, education, and religion, and they assumed that that would be Christian religion, even if people weren't Christians. That's what Christendom is. Christendom is not that everybody's a Christian. Christendom is the privilege and place of Christianity within culture and the home court advantage. In 1963, when Hollywood Presbyterian Church was the largest Presbyterian church and was featured in the LA Times that had Bible verses being published for you every week to help you with your morning quiet time, the Billy Graham crusades were at an all-time high. It's not that people didn't need Jesus. It's just that the whole world was shaped around the privilege of Christianity. This radical experience of change is what many pastors have had to grapple with over the last 20 years or so. A radical changing that has only accelerated as we've gone into the pandemic. In 2010, Fuller Seminary decided to investigate this a bit by talking to our alums. Now, let me give you some inside baseball from a former seminary administrator. If you get a survey from your institution as an alumni, know that it's coming from the development department. It's coming from the people whose job is to raise funds for the institution from its alumni. Why were we surveying our alumni? Because our alumni weren't giving as much money as we thought they would. There's whole models about the way in which, as your alumni base gets bigger and older, it should give you more money. And ours wasn't. So we got a high-priced consulting firm to come in and teach us how to ask the questions of our alums, because you just don't ask them, hey, why aren't you giving us more money? And instead, the high-priced consulting firm asked this question. It asked, how do you feel about Fuller Seminary? And the answer was, we love Fuller Seminary. We're proud of Fuller Seminary. We're proud of being part of the 20,000 graduates, the 40,000 alums, the students who are gathered in 400 countries that come from Fuller Seminary. We can't wait to get back to Pasadena and get a new t-shirt. We love Fuller Seminary. But, and that's what you listen for, seminary didn't prepare me for this. You see, while the culture has moved quickly from a Christendom to a post-Christendom world, while in most places Christianity is no longer in the center of culture, and many of our churches are split over what to do with it. Do we try to seize back culture, or do we try to think of a new way of being the witness of God in the world? Seminary wasn't even asking those questions for most of the time. Seminary was preparing people for that post-Christendom world, for that Christendom world, even in a deeply post-Christendom time. So what do? Darrell Guter from Princeton Seminary put it this way: if Western societies have become post-Christian mission fields, how can traditional churches become them missionary churches? What Dr. Guter was asking 20 years ago is a question that is even more profound today. The mission field is not over seawater. It's across the sidewalk, and oftentimes it's sitting in the same pew with us. The mission field, the place where we are to demonstrate and proclaim the reign of God, the love and justice of God, is all around us. And so the way in which we think about ourselves as congregations has to radically change even now. Fast forward even more, now to 2017. and I'm sitting in a Silicon Valley boardroom. In 2014, I came to Fuller Seminary because our then new president, Mark Labradon, had read the alumni survey and had decided that we needed to do a better job of preparing church pastors for a changing world. And one of the things that we would do is do a better job of our spiritual formation for leadership while they're in seminary. After 3 years of working on that problem and handing that over to a group of people, I was asked to take on the next challenge, which is how are we going to continue to resource the church in a world where less and less people are coming to the seminary? There are about 10,000 less seminarians today in all of the seminaries across the country than there were, say, 10 years ago. So in a world where less people want our degrees, and when many less people want to take on debt, how are we supposed to serve and resource the church? How do we live out our calling as a seminary and as an academic institution? I was tasked with that challenge, with that question. Was pulling a team together, and we were working on how to develop resources and how to develop deeper relationships with church boards and denominations across the country to be able to serve leaders in real time for life. When one of our trustees heard me give a presentation at our board of trustees meeting, because he was a lawyer who worked in Silicon Valley, his ears perked up. He said, what you're trying to do is do something that is called intrapreneurial. It's like what an entrepreneur does in an established institution. It's fraught with problems. Traditional institutions are usually not very entrepreneurial places. And you might want to get some help from people who are really good entrepreneurs. You're talking about doing a startup in an older institution. So what if I was to gather some people who are all Christians, who all care about Fuller Seminary, but who are all out of the startup world, and they were to be able to speak into your ideas? Well, I immediately jumped at the chance. And within a few weeks, I was on a plane flying to San Jose, California, where I then went to Palo Alto. And in one of those famous streets in a lawyer's boardroom with people who are all gathered from either the tech industry, and many of them were high-level executives from a number of the companies that you would recognize, or they were venture capitalists who were used to funding startups like some of these companies. They gathered together and they asked me to spend some time giving them my pitch. They said, Todd, give us a pitch. That's what we're used to. Give us in 10 minutes what you're trying to do and why we should fund it. And let's be really clear. We're not going to give you any money. We're just giving you advice today. But we'd like to hear your pitch. Why is this thing so important? And who are you trying to help? And I went, this is great. I said, we want to help the church continue to grow in its leadership capacity in a radically changing world. But we want to do so knowing that they don't need our degrees and they don't need to take on debt. That with a lower number of students, we think there'll be a growing number of learners, and we'd like to know how to serve them. They said, great, tell us how you're going to do it. And I launched into my pitch. And 10 minutes later, with my PowerPoint now finished, I paused and I looked around the room and they were all smirking. And they were smiling at me. They looked at me and they laughed. They were kind of laughing. And finally I said, what? Did I forget something? What? And one of them says, you've been doing that talk around Fuller a lot, haven't you? I said, oh, yeah. I've had to talk to the board of trustees. I've had to talk to the faculty to get them on board. I've had to talk to people I'm trying to hire. I got to raise money. Yeah. Oh, you bet. He said, that's really great because what you just told us is a 10-minute presentation on why this was really, really necessary for Fuller Seminary. Todd, I know you think you need to do this for your institution to survive, but nobody cares if your institution survives. They only care if your institution cares about them. You see, you need to get out and talk to people out in the pews and in the world about their pain and their need and ask how you can serve them. I mean, Jesus said something similar, right? That if we're going to love God, we have to love our neighbor. Don't you think this is really should be an exercise in loving your neighbor and not just your own school survival? I need to tell you that anytime the venture capitalist gives a Bible lesson to the theology professor, it's a bad day for the theology professor. But he was exactly right. You see, the default behavior of most institutions, including in our most churches, is to try to change the church for the sake of our members. It's try to make our internal people happier. It's to try to change the church so that it continues to be a place where our members feel comfortable and are more engaged and will give more and serve more, rather than transform our members for the sake of God's mission in the world. The radical change that's needed in a radically changing world is within us. It's our transformation. But very often, strategic planning, congregational initiatives, missional engagement actually end up coming back to what is due for our members. And this must be radically disrupted in a world that is already radically disrupted. We are now in uncharted territory. Literally, we have gone off the map. There are no best practices for a day like today. We have never been in a post-Christendom world, especially a world like today. A world where that has been not only disrupted through changes of decline and change, but radically interrupted because of the pandemic. The first rule for uncharted territory is that the world in front of you is nothing like the world behind you. That you will not be able to rely on the best practices of the past. That you'll have to lead differently than probably you were even trained to do. And so as we think about what it is to go into uncharted territory, to do church differently, to enter into this world and this opportunity, not just to survive, but to thrive, how do we need to think about the church differently? Let's start with the basics. The fundamental task of leadership is a discernment task. It's distinguishing between what do we preserve and what do we change. It's acknowledging that every institution, especially the church, that has been entrusted with the gospel, needs to always be discerning. What do you preserve? What should never change? What if we change it, do we lose our birthright and our reason for being? And then what needs to change in order to protect our birthright and our reason for being? The fundamental task of leadership is distinguishing between what needs to be preserved and what needs to change. And this happens in every decision we make. So let's look at what one church decided was so important to preserve, it etched it in stone. Can you see that? This was a wealthy church. And in the early part of the 20th century, when they were building their cathedral, this church was made up of the kinds of people who had sailed on ocean liners to Europe and seen the greatest cathedrals. And they wanted to build a cathedral to the glory of God in their own Eastern urban city. Billy Graham called this church the leading church in America at one time. And they were able to build this church as a great Gothic cathedral with Tiffany stained glass windows that is beautiful even to this day. But when a group of people came together to decide what they would put over the door, they, of course, decided to chisel in stone these words, expecting that as long as this church stood and until Jesus came back, what we know to be clear is this would be the First Presbyterian Church. Notice the. That doesn't have to say where it is. Of course you know where you are. And there would be, until Jesus returns, a morning service at 10:45 and an evening service at 7:45. And we don't even have to say when, do we? Because everybody knows that would be Sunday morning. Now, the reason I show this picture is that 100 years after this was carved, I know the pastor of the church. I've worked with him. And This church oftentimes has 3 or 4 services, especially before COVID, in 3 or 4 different languages, sometimes on 2 or 3 different days, something that could never have been conceived 100 years ago. And the second thing is, I know the person who was the pastor of this church in the 1970s. He's now well retired, but he told me that as a young pastor in the 1970s, his first significant leadership challenge was having to close the evening service. The evening service that had for a generation been part of what they did every single week now had declined precipitously because of this new radical innovation called 60 Minutes, a weekly news magazine that became the most popular show in America, and it refashioned American television viewing habits. Sunday night now became, for those who had televisions, TV family night. I often joke that my wife and I are unequally yoked, that she grew up in a CBS family watching 60 Minutes and Gunsmoke, and I grew up in an NBC family watching The Wonderful World of Disney and Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. But what is true is that we both grew up watching television as a family on Sunday nights. And that external behavior in our culture disrupted internal church institutions like evening services. I use this illustration to illustrate that if the fundamental task of leadership is distinguishing between what needs to be preserved and what needs to change, we're not going to get it perfectly right. We can't perfectly predict the future. It's not about figuring out forever what should never change, but getting really, really clear on the essentials that cannot change, and then being prepared to change everything else. That it is a process of discernment that we will go through over and over and over again. And change, for most of us, is excruciatingly hard. Alan Deutschman wrote a book called Change or Die. It's a book literally about people who were told by their doctors they need to change or die. These were the kind of people who had that uncomfortable conversation where the doctor looks at you after you've finished your annual exam and glances at his watch and says, let's do something. Why don't you get dressed and then meet me in my office? And immediately you know that your heart begins to beat. You know he has just disrupted his entire day for whatever he has to tell you. And you walk into his office and you have a slight bit of relief from your anxiety. You realize this is a well-appointed office with heavy furniture, with expensive decorations, where there are pictures of the wall of fancy vacations, and that there are certifications of magna cum laude this and summa cum laude that, and board certified this and board certified that. And you realize, oh, this is a very competent doctor. I'm in really good hands. But when you sit yourself down at the chair where the desk feels to come up to your eyeballs, and the doctor walks in nervously, barely looks at you, settles into his own chair and opens a file. He turns the file around and he says, look at this with me. You see these numbers? These numbers are really important. People with these numbers don't immediately resolve things. You have to make choices. You see, people with these numbers, this is serious. What I need you to know is this. If you don't change your life today, you're going to die. One more cigarette, one more drink, one more big piece of chocolate cake, one more drug. You will die. You'll not see your children grow up or your grandchildren play. Your life will end sooner than you want. What Alan Deutschman did is figured out that when people were put in that circumstance where they were surrounded by authority, even the authority of an older, wealthier, professional man, when they were surrounded by the trappings of credibility, when they were giving facts that they could look at that they couldn't argue with. And when they were given a clear call to action, you must do this. Then when given a choice, only 90% of them would die. 90% would die because change is that hard. We are that resistant to change. We think we are the 10% that won't die. We think we are the person who will be able to overcome the brutality of the reality. And we go into deep denial because we are so resistant to change. If you've been trying to bring change to your congregation, if you've been trying to sound the alarm about the need to change and about the need for us to do wise, faithful change, and you've been hitting resistance, you're not crazy. This is how difficult it is for human beings to change even something of life and death. So what do we do? Alan Deutschman gives us a way forward. He studied the 10% that did change. It's called a positive deviance study is what it is. It's a study that where you don't look at the excuses. You look at those who made the change and you learn from them. And this is what he learned. In studying the 10% that did change, he discovered that there are 3 very, very popular techniques for change that do not work. That what doesn't produce change is fear, facts, and force. This is what most of us use. Change or die. We have an urgency. We got to change today. And fear will make people change temporarily. I'm of a generation where in elementary schools, they used to show us film strips where they wanted to get us to brush our teeth with fluoride toothpaste so that our teeth wouldn't rot out. And so they would show us these pictures of children with their teeth rotting out because they didn't brush their teeth. And then they would hand us a shiny new toothbrush and send us home to brush our teeth every day. And what they found was that the kids would brush the heck out of their teeth for 2 days. And then their dental hygiene habits would actually get worse. Fear doesn't produce lasting change. Facts don't bring change either. Many of us think if we just have the facts, well, then that'll bring change. And if anything, what we've learned is that we can find ways to argue around or pick facts that make us comfortable with our own version of the status quo. Has that not been exactly what is at the heart of so much of the conflict that we have in our country today? Whose facts? Alternative facts. Who trusts facts? Facts don't bring change. And the last thing that also doesn't bring change, at least lasting change, is force. You really can't make people change. Again, maybe temporarily, but not over a long period of time. This is the most depressing part for those of us who are on, for those of our friends who are on the younger side. Very many of my students, I've heard them say stuff like, look, when the last baby boomer dies and we're in charge, well, then when we have the authority and the power, then things will change. What they don't realize is that what we know for a fact is that authority and power tends to change us more than we can use it to change others. So fear, facts, and force don't bring change. So what does? What if you can't use these things, which I have sometimes jokingly called, these are a few of my favorite things, and they don't work? What does bring change? Relate, repeat, reframe. Radically. Not fear, facts, and force. Relate, repeat, reframe. What does that mean? What brings change? Relate. New communities, relationships bring change. If you find yourself in a new community, you will take on the values of that community. If you engage yourself more deeply in relationships, you will change for your relationships. So for those of us who live our lives in the community that is the church, the more that our church lives out and loves and cares for people, the more people will change. Second, repeat. It can't just be a community. It has to be a community of practice. You actually have to put into practice new ways of being in order to change your beliefs or your thinking. So taking baby steps toward new practices in relationship tend to bring change. It's one of the reasons why if you really want to lose weight, one of the best things you can do is join a walking group. a group of people who are committed to regularly being healthy. And that begin to take on the practices, and when new relationships and new practices lead you to reframe new ways of thinking. And those new ways of thinking then become deeply embedded the more radical they are. And what I mean by radical is this, that it has to get to the root of the issue. It has to go to the center of your motivations, that you have to be addressing something that is core to who you are, that you can't bring lasting change through tweaking around the edges. So relate, repeat, reframe radically. By radical, I don't mean reckless, and I don't mean ruthless. I mean that you have to get to the heart of the issue, the root cause, the key challenge in front of us, and bring people together to begin to function and practice in new ways, so that with new learning, they can begin to reframe their thinking and make shifts in their perspectives that lead to the kind of deeper beliefs that bring lasting change. Ed Friedman talks about it this way. If you're familiar with Ed Friedman, he was a Jewish rabbi who spent his entire career in a synagogue outside of Washington, D.C., over 40 years. He was also a marriage and family therapist who was trained in Bowenian systems theory. And he applied that family systems theory to his thinking about the church and religious organizations. And he was a consultant in Washington, D.C. So church, family, government, he saw dysfunction at every level. And he describes it this way. He says, when any relationship system is imaginatively gridlocked. I love this sentence. This is a really critical sentence for me. First of all, to remember that wherever we function, we are functioning first and foremost in a relationship system. For those of us in the church, this is a good reminder. We are not an institution first and foremost, an organization first and foremost, not even a movement first and foremost. We are a relationship. We are brothers and sisters in Christ. We are members of one another. When any relationship system is imaginatively gridlocked, look at that phrase, imaginatively gridlocked. When was the last time you were in a meeting that was imaginatively gridlocked, when you couldn't think beyond the old ideas, the old structures, when you found yourself arguing and stuck and you just wanted some bright new idea? One pastor friend said to me, I can't remember a meeting that I was in that wasn't imaginatively gridlocked. And if you haven't experienced that in a while, I would invite you to most faculty meetings, where the smarter people are, according to Adam Grant, the harder it is for them to think again, to unlearn, to reconsider their previous ideas. And so very often they are imaginatively gridlocked. When any relationship system is imaginatively gridlocked, it cannot get free simply through more thinking about the problem. Conceptually stuck systems cannot be unstuck simply by trying harder. What I want to say to you is that in all the things that I'm going to share, I don't want you once to hear me say, try harder, dig in, commit yourself to more energy and effort. That's not the point. Asking people to try harder to overcome in a changing world is like asking people to paddle harder in a canoe that is in a river that has run out of water. You'll just exhaust yourself and you'll make no progress. Conceptually stuck systems cannot be unstuck simply by trying harder. For a fundamental reorientation to occur, that spirit of adventure, which optimizes serendipity and which enables new perceptions beyond the control of our thinking processes, must happen first. You see what has to happen? There has to be a shift, a reframe, to be able to see what you couldn't see before. That shift, that reframe, we know from Alan Duchman, comes through communities of people practicing together, learning to see differently. There needs to be a spirit of adventure, which optimizes new learning, which helps us to see new things. It helps us to break out of our imaginative gridlock by keeping us from defaulting to our old ways of being. What does Friedman mean by a spirit of adventure? He means that it's going to require learning, and it's going to result in facing loss. Learning and loss. For many of us, this is at the heart of the challenge we face today. Many of us, especially if you are higher up in the organization, you're a pastor of a church, you're a mid-level executive, you're in charge of the denomination, you're a person who's invested a lot in this denomination, you've got a large investment in their pension program or whatever it would be. The further up, the more accomplished, the more of an expert you are, the more disorienting it is to realize that your only way forward begins in learning. And the only way forward will result in loss. A spirit of adventure requires learning, and it results in facing loss. And so it requires that all of us who take on the mantle of leadership begin with an attitude of learning, of humility, of teachability, and are willing to trust God with our losses and be able to take other people through their losses. The only way forward is through learning and loss. Eric Hoffer said, "In times of great change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists." I work in a seminary. I have a PhD. I'm surrounded by colleagues who are experts in their field and who are dedicated to serving God with their minds and their writings and their research. I get to work with denominational leaders all over the country, with pastors of congregations who are incredibly competent at what they do. And the disruption of this moment, it reminds us that we are in a moment where those of us who expected that at this stage of our lives, of our careers, of our ministries, we would have a kind of expertise, that we would be seen as the wise, learned people that others would trust to, now begin to recognize that we are beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. If 1963 ever comes back, we Presbyterians are going to rule it. We know what to do with 1963. And 1963 was our heyday, at least the heyday for people who look like me. And to enter into a world where we see the larger global church, the diversity of God's creation, the people who were left out in the Christendom world because they were on the margins, and believe that we are in a world that is moving closer and closer to the pictures of Revelation, where every tribe and tongue and nation are joined together before the throne of God. To believe that this is part of the mission of God moving us forward, and not just some anxious moment of losing of power and privilege, is going to require us to become learners and to face losses. The three hardest words for most people to say are not "I love you." They're not even "I forgive you." They are "I don't know." You're the experts. You're the leader. You're the person who people are looking to. You're the one. And they look at you and say, "Pastor," or they look at you and say, "Board, together, can you please tell us, what are we going to do?" And in a radically changing world that is disrupted continually, very often the only honest answer is to stand before them with all the trust that you have engendered and say to them, "I don't know." But together we will learn, and we will face whatever losses come. The University of Leeds did a study on this, and what they studied was 7-year-olds who were asked a nonsense question, like, what does blue smell like? Or what do feet have for breakfast? And what they found is that at 7, the majority of kids, even at 7, would make up an answer. And when they asked them why, the response was because they felt embarrassed not to know. If that's true at 7, how true is it at 37 or 47 or 57 or 67? The three hardest words for us to say are "I don't know." But that's exactly the place where leadership in a changing world starts today. The world in front of you is nothing like the world behind you. You are in uncharted territory. We are off the map. We are having to learn as we go. And leadership is about leading the learning. For me, there's been no place where this has been more true than my confronting the degree to the blind spots of my life have been shaped by the privileges that I've been given in my life. When I was 23 years old, I was given a full ride scholarship to one of the leading seminaries because I was invited to go on the staff of one of the leading churches. And what I realized is that that church had money to invest in people who look like me. The reason today, while there are so many people who look like me at the top of our organizations, is because 30 years ago, the only people who anybody could envision being a leader is someone who looks like me. And after 17 years of serving as a senior pastor in a predominantly white congregation in Orange County, California, when I came back to Fuller Seminary, I found myself challenged, and very often challenged by my students who were pointing out blind spots, things I couldn't see about the way the world worked, about my own position or privilege or assumptions or expectations. And I began to study and I began to read articles about cultural competence. And I began to realize I wanted to grow in this area, that I wanted to be able to understand the way in which my privileged, my learnedness, the things that I had been given were actually now holding me back from leading in a day like today. And so I went to a trusted advisor and I said, look, I've got some professional development funds. You are a person who could be helpful. He is himself a leader of color who has been deeply respected around the country in lots of different places. And I knew him well. And I said, I've got some funds. I would like to invest in cultural competency coaching. I read about cultural competency and I know that I need to develop that. And so would you help me with that? And he immediately wrote back and said, why are you thinking this? And I said, look, I'm a 50-something white guy who's been shaped predominantly in white institutions and in a world that looks more and more like the kingdom of God and should be, where there are more voices and more diversity and more people are talking about the injustices. I need to learn to be more culturally competent. He wrote me back and said, Todd, you're a 50-something white guy who's been mostly shaped by predominantly white institutions. And indeed, you were giving leadership of those institutions at an early age. You've had very few people even question your ideas for the last 20 years. Let me just tell you this now. You'll never be culturally competent. So what if we worked on cultural humility? You see, cultural humility is what's needed at this moment. Not cultural competence, cultural humility. Check. And I sent him a check and engaged him as a coach so that I could learn how to lead in this world that I believe looks more and more like what God wants for the world. The picture we see of the New Testament church and the Church of Revelation that I've only been able to see through the eyes of my culture and background and privilege. How do we learn to lead differently in this radically changing, disruptive world? People don't resist change, they resist loss. That's what Ronald Heifetz said. When we talk about how hard it is for people to change, what we're really talking about is how hard it is for people to face the losses they're going to have to go through. Loss of esteem, loss of power, loss of privilege, loss of all the things that they love and things that are dear. The number of people who've told me, I feel like I lost my church. My colleague who said to me, whatever happened to R. Fuller? Remember what it was like? I do remember what it was like. People don't resist change, they resist loss. When people are resistant to change, they are resisting losses. And the scriptures are clear that the path forward is through loss. Unless a seed falls to the earth and dies, John writes, it remains a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. What does it mean for us to be in that age and stage of the life of the church where we must be willing to learn and we must be willing to let go? The world in front of you is nothing like the world behind you, and everybody will be changed, especially the leader. When I first came to Fuller Seminary, and I was their newly minted vice president for the sake of changing the church, the school for the future, they sent me one day on a tour around my different departments. I was a vice president. There were several different departments, and I would meet the people who I would be working with. And I was thrilled to meet them. And I went into one of the offices, and they said, "We're so glad you're here. We've got some cookies and stuff. We want to wait for a second. One of the people we want you to meet is a student still, and he's finishing up class, and he'll be here in just a second." And I remember waiting for him to get here. And when they got here, they introduced me to him. And they said, "Todd, we'd like you to meet Pablo Kim." Pablo Kim. They said, "He's one of our best students. He's about to graduate. He's going to go on into ministry. We're very proud of him. We think that he's going to be a great leader. And we'd like you to meet him, even though you're going to only work with him for a few weeks before graduation." But notice his name, Pablo Kim. His parents were Korean missionaries to Argentina. He grew up speaking Korean in the home and Spanish in school, and he learned English so that he could go on and get 3 master's degrees. The future of the church does not look like Todd Bolsinger. It looks like Pablo Kim or Juanita Kim. The future of the church that is most vibrant today is in the African American church, the Latina church, the immigrant church. One of the great disruptions of the day is to recognize that when they look at the patterns of decreasing religiosity in the world, in the church of the United States today, we're now under 50% of people see they are aligned or members of any church or synagogue or mosque. That is accelerated amongst older and dominant. It is accelerated whenever you look at, when you take away older or dominant people and you look at places of younger, white, dominant institutions. Where is there still vibrancy? The African American church, the Latino church, the immigrant church. Want to know one of the reasons why the United States has not declined as rapidly as Europe? One of the fundamental reasons: immigration. Christians come to this country. They set up their vibrant churches. They come with their history of being outcasts and aliens, of having to find a new place. And they offer themselves community and witness of resilience, while oftentimes being ignored or discarded by the very culture that has embraced them. This disruption is also, I believe, part of God's deep provision. Dave Gibbons, an Asian American pastor who started a multicultural church over 20 years ago in what was then dominantly white Orange County, the same area that I worked and served, said the future is already here. It's just on the margins. Our problem with those of us who were trained in the center is that we don't often have the eyes to see what God is already doing. And if those of us in the dead center can open up and learn to listen to those who are vibrantly ministering on the margins, can learn, can experience and let go of some of our power, privilege, assumptions, we will find that God is already present to us in profoundly, beautifully redemptive ways.
It's this conviction that the future is here, but is on the margins, that is actually the most hopeful part of this reality for me. It means that God's Spirit is way bigger than any of our constructs, that the Spirit of God is often way ahead of us, and that we get an opportunity to experience again what it's like to lean into the discernment of the Spirit rather than rely upon our own institutional power and privilege. This is a great moment for discernment, for surprise, for serendipity, but it's going to require us to have a kind of humility and openness that God's Spirit has been at work in places that we haven't seen before. My encouragement to all of you as you think about this changing world is to, in your hearts, deeply believe that God's Spirit has been at work all over the world, in your neighborhoods and in your environments, in your communities, in our nations. And that even though we are being pressed into uncharted territory, God goes before us. The pillar of smoke, the pillar of clouds, the voice in the wilderness, God is before us. So let us follow and trust that God's going to transform us to hear his voice more and more. God bless you as you do.